Picture this. The sun sets over the blood-soaked hills of Spain, where broken French eagles lie scattered across the dirt. The drums of Napoleon's empire have fallen silent, replaced by whispers of vengeance and resistance. From shattered villages to mountain passes, unseen fighters strike from the shadows, haunting the world's greatest army. This isn't just a rebellion, it's a wound so deep it will never heal. And soon, even Napoleon will call it his Spanish ulcer. In 1808, Europe stood at the height of Napoleon Bonaparte's power. His armies had conquered almost every corner of the continent, spreading the ideals of his empire through sheer force and fear. But when France turned its eyes towards Spain, everything changed. The invasion that was meant to secure the Iberian Peninsula became a slow, brutal collapse. Spanish civilians, peasants, farmers, priests, even children rose up in defiance against the French occupiers. Their resistance wasn't organized by generals or kings, but born from desperation, faith, and fury. What began as a series of scattered revolts soon evolved into one of the first modern guerrilla wars in history. Every road, every mountain, every shadow became a battlefield. And as Britain joined the fight under Arthur Wellesley, soon to be the Duke of Wellington, the stage was set for a long and bloody struggle that would shatter Napoleon's illusion of invincibility. This is the story of how ordinary people turned an empire's pride into its slow, agonizing downfall. Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Let us know in the comments, and if you enjoy dark history stories like this, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share your feedback in the comments. The French army entered Spain like a tide of iron and smoke, certain that victory would come as easily as it had in Vienna or Berlin. Columns of blue-coated soldiers marched beneath the burning Iberian sun, their drums echoing through the valleys, their banners gleaming with imperial pride. But this land was different. The people did not surrender. The terrain itself seemed to rebel. Roads turned into traps, villages turned into graves, and every whisper carried the promise of blood. When Napoleon's brother Joseph took the Spanish throne, few imagined the nightmare that would follow. In Madrid, the uprising began with stones and kitchen knives, ordinary citizens throwing themselves against trained soldiers. The French crushed them brutally, their cannons tearing through narrow streets, but the violence only fed the fire. Soon, the entire country rose like a wounded beast. Peasants, monks, and shepherds took up muskets, axes, and even farm tools. They did not fight for conquest. They fought for their homes, their saints, their dead. Imagine standing there, in a mountain village, hearing the sound of hooves and boots approach. You know it's the French patrol. You hide in silence, clutching a blade you've sharpened on the same stone where your father once cut bread. The night smells of smoke and fear, and then, when the enemy least expects it, you strike. The guerrillas were ghosts of the hills. They attacked supply convoys, ambushed officers, and disappeared before dawn. French soldiers began to fear the countryside. Even drinking water became dangerous. Wells were poisoned and roads littered with traps. The Spanish called their resistance guerrilla, little war. But for the empire, it was death by 1,000 cuts. Napoleon had underestimated something greater than any army, the will of a nation that refused to be conquered. In the cities, secret cells spread information, forged weapons, and sent messengers across mountains. Women carried coded letters sewn into their dresses. Priests blessed fighters before vanishing into the forests. The social order turned itself into an invisible weapon, and with every passing week, the French found themselves sinking deeper into the land they thought they ruled. Yet the French were no strangers to terror. They answered fire with fire. Villages suspected of aiding rebels were burned. Entire families were executed in public squares. Children were made to watch. The message was clear. Resistance meant extinction. But instead of fear, it bred fury. Every atrocity became a call to arms. The painter Francisco Goya captured it all in his haunting sketches. Men shot against walls, women dragged by soldiers. The horror of empire laid bare in ink and blood. Imagine those scenes coming alive, the screams, the smoke, the echo of gunshots fading into silence. Spain was becoming a graveyard of innocence, and the French, trapped within it, could not escape the rot spreading through their ranks. As months turned to years, the French generals reported victory after victory to Paris, but their maps told another story. Every time a town was pacified, another rose behind it. Supply lines stretched thin across hostile terrain. Horses starved, muskets rusted, and morale crumbled. Napoleon, furious at the stalemate, sent his best marshals, Soult, Ney, and Massena, but even their brilliance could not tame the chaos. For every French column that marched into the hills, only fragments returned. Disease spread, desertions rose, and the whispers of the Spanish ulcer began among the officers. This was no longer a campaign, it was slow suffocation, and in the shadows, Britain saw its chance. Arthur Wellesley, calm and calculating, landed his troops in Portugal. His plan was not just to fight battles, but to turn the guerrillas into allies. For the first time, Spain's struggle became part of a larger war, a storm that would change Europe forever. The arrival of the British army under Arthur Wellesley marked a new chapter in the struggle. To the weary Spanish fighters, he seemed like a promise of salvation, disciplined, strategic, and unyielding. But even Wellesley, who would later become the Duke of Wellington, quickly learned that the Peninsular War was unlike any conflict he had ever known. The terrain itself was treacherous, the weather unforgiving, and the French, though stretched thin, were still formidable opponents. In the early campaigns, victories were never clean. They came with staggering losses and the bitter aftertaste of devastation. Towns like Talavera, Badajoz, and Ciudad Rodrigo became synonymous with slaughter. Imagine standing amid the smoke of those battlefields, the stench of blood and powder in the air, listening to the moans of men crushed by cannon fire. There was no glory here, only endurance. The French fought like cornered wolves, but the Spanish and British alliance held, not because of superiority in numbers or weapons, but because of something far more relentless: belief. By 1810, the French controlled most of Spain on paper, yet the countryside remained a labyrinth of rebellion. Convoys disappeared without trace, messengers were found hanging from trees, and entire regiments vanished into the mountains. French generals began to dread reports from their subordinates. They no longer spoke of victory, but of survival. The term Spanish ulcer, first whispered in private, became Napoleon's own curse. He was the master of Europe, but here he was powerless. His men could not hold what they conquered, and his reputation for invincibility began to crumble. Letters from the front described horrors that sounded like nightmares: bodies mutilated beyond recognition, soldiers losing their minds in isolated garrisons, French officers begging for reassignment. Every day felt like another wound to the empire's pride. The guerrilla leaders themselves became legends. There was Juan Martín Díaz, known as El Empecinado, the stubborn one, whose very name terrified French patrols. He would appear without warning, strike, and vanish like mist. There was the priest Geronimo Marino, who blessed his men with one hand and fired a musket with the other. Their followers were farmers, blacksmiths, and shepherds, yet they learned to move like shadows, coordinated by nothing more than instinct and faith. For every battle lost, they struck 10 blows in return, and though they lacked formal training, their deep knowledge of the land gave them an advantage no general could replicate. Imagine trudging through a narrow mountain pass at dusk, your nerves stretched thin, your canteen nearly empty. Then, out of nowhere, gunfire erupts from the cliffs. You return fire into the fog, but see no enemy, only the echo of your own panic. That was life for the French soldier in Spain, endless, invisible dread. Wellington understood this new form of warfare better than most. He didn't simply command from a distance, he adapted. Using the guerrillas' tactics to feed his intelligence network, he turned Spain into a trap. Every French movement was reported, every weakness exploited. The coordination between British regulars and local fighters became a living organism, constantly evolving. The French, meanwhile, were forced to divide their forces, spreading themselves thin across hundreds of miles. Each isolated unit became an easy target. When Wellington advanced, his army moved like a tide supported by invisible hands. He would later call his Spanish allies the most dangerous enemies the French ever faced. Yet even with cooperation, progress was slow and brutal. Every victory left the land in ruins. Entire towns were reduced to rubble, and famine stalked the survivors. History often glorifies war, but here, even triumph was painted in misery. Still, the tide began to turn. After years of blood and attrition, the combined might of Spanish guerrillas, British soldiers, and Portuguese allies started to break the French grip. The turning point came with the Battle of Salamanca in 1812, a clash that shattered the myth of French invincibility. Wellington's strategy was precise and patient. When he finally struck, it was devastating. French lines crumbled under coordinated assaults, and panic spread through their ranks. The British artillery thundered across the plains, cutting down cavalry and infantry alike. In that moment, Napoleon's empire felt the first true tremor of collapse. News of the defeat raced across Europe like wildfire. Even in Paris, whispers grew that the emperor had stretched himself too far. Spain had become his bleeding wound, a constant drain on men, money, and morale. And just as Wellington marched deeper into Spanish territory, the emperor faced a new catastrophe in the east, his invasion of Russia. The timing could not have been worse. Spain, once seen as a mere sideshow, now became the trap that weakened the master of Europe before his greatest fall. By 1813, the French occupation of Spain was collapsing under its own weight. The proud legions that had once marched in perfect formation were now ghosts, scattered across a land that no longer feared them. The countryside, once the backdrop of terror, had turned into a living, breathing resistance. Villages that had been burned were rebuilt with defiance. Bells rang not for prayer but for warning, signaling the approach of French patrols. Even the air seemed to turn against the invaders, thick with smoke and whispers. Napoleon's empire had begun to rot from within. His marshals quarreled, his soldiers starved, and his allies wavered. What began as a swift conquest had become a bleeding wound, one that no victory elsewhere could heal. Imagine being one of those French soldiers, once a symbol of the emperor's might, now reduced to a frightened man in a hostile land, haunted by the faces of peasants who would rather die than bow. The fear was constant, the hatred mutual, and the silence between ambushes deafening. Wellington pressed forward with methodical pressure. Sion, his army hardened by years of brutal campaigns, advanced through Spain like a storm that could not be stopped. At the Battle of Vittoria, the French made their last desperate stand. The clash was ferocious. Drums beating, muskets cracking, cavalry charging through smoke and chaos. For hours the valley echoed with the sound of empire tearing itself apart. The Spanish guerrillas fought alongside British and Portuguese troops, their rage sharpened by years of suffering. When the smoke cleared, French banners lay trampled in the mud. The once mighty imperial army was shattered, retreating in disorder toward the Pyrenees. It was not just a military defeat, it was humiliation on a scale Napoleon had never imagined. The treasure wagons, filled with looted gold and art, were abandoned as soldiers fled for their lives. In those moments, Spain reclaimed not just its land, but its dignity. The people who had once fought with kitchen knives and pitchforks had broken an empire. As the French retreated across the border, the full toll of the war became visible. Fields lay barren, cities reduced to ashes, and countless graves dotted the hills. The guerrillas who had survived now faced a new kind of silence, the emptiness left after vengeance is fulfilled. Wellington himself was haunted by what he had witnessed. He had won, but at a cost that defied reason. More than 500,000 lives had been lost across the Iberian Peninsula. The Spanish called it liberation, but the land felt more like a vast cemetery. Even Goya, who had once chronicled the atrocities, withdrew into darkness, painting visions of despair and madness that captured the soul of a nation scarred beyond repair. The war had created no heroes, only survivors. And in Paris, the emperor, once invincible, was consumed by reports of disaster. The same year he lost Spain, he would march into Russia and meet a far greater catastrophe. The ulcer had spread, draining his empire of its strength and its myth of perfection. Looking back, historians often call the Peninsular War the beginning of Napoleon's end, but for the people who lived through it, it was more than a military turning point. It was proof that power built on fear cannot last. The Spanish peasantry, the very lowest of society, had done what no army could. They forced the most powerful man in Europe to bleed. The term guerrilla, born from their struggle, would echo through centuries of warfare to come. Every insurgent, every resistance fighter, whoever struck from the shadows, owes something to that brutal, heroic defiance. Imagine the final scenes, the French army disappearing into the mist, the Spanish villages slowly returning to life, the church bells ringing once more, not for warning, but for mourning. The empire had fallen, not with a grand surrender, but with exhaustion. The Spanish ulcer had done its work. Napoleon's glory had turned to rot, and Europe would never be the same again. History often remembers empires by their victories, but Spain's story reminds us that collapse can come not from great battles, but from quiet, relentless resistance. The Spanish ulcer was more than a military campaign. It was a test of endurance, faith, and human will. Ordinary people, farmers, priests, mothers, and children, turned the tools of survival into weapons of liberation. They fought not for glory, but for dignity, and in doing so they reshaped the world's understanding of power. Napoleon's armies could conquer cities, but they could never conquer the human spirit that burned in the hills of Spain, and in that his downfall was inevitable. So, as you drift to sleep tonight, remember this: even the mightiest fall when the people refuse to break. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to subscribe, hit the bell icon, like the video, and tell us in the comments what PE of stories you'd like to see. Your support helps bring more untold history to light and keeps these forgotten voices alive.